Picture this, Adam and Eve standing completely naked in Eden, feeling zero shame. Not because they were naive, but because God knew them through pure mercy. Today, we're exploring a radical idea that God's omniscience isn't cosmic surveillance, it's divine mercy experiencing all creation through compassionate consciousness. We'll uncover how pride blocks this merciful connection, why the fall was really about rejecting God's merciful authority, and how the Sabbath serves as our weekly reset to that original transparency.
So let me get this straight. You're saying God doesn't know everything like some kind of divine security camera, but actually experiences creation through mercy itself?
Exactly. Think about it this way. When the Sabbath school lesson talks about God's omniscience, it's not describing cold, calculating knowledge. According to the page content, God's knowledge is relational. The lesson emphasizes that our value comes from God because we were created by Him and are those for whom Christ died. That's mercy-based knowing.
That completely reframes the Garden of Eden story. So when it says Adam and Eve were naked and felt no shame...
Right. Their nakedness wasn't just physical, it represented complete transparency with God through His merciful consciousness. No barriers, no hiding, no shame, because God's knowing was pure mercy. They experienced His omniscience as love, not judgment.
But then Satan introduced doubt and blame. The lesson mentions how Satan planted doubt in Adam's and Eve's minds and tempted them to love and trust self above God. So what happened to that merciful connection?
This is where pride becomes the ultimate blocker. The lesson explains that pride first began with Lucifer, and it's described as feeling you are more important or better than other people. When Adam and Eve chose pride over humility, they essentially blocked God's merciful omniscience from flowing through them.
So the fig leaves weren't just covering their bodies, they were covering their whole person from God's mercy?
Precisely. And here's what's fascinating. The lesson quotes Ellen White saying that pride is the most offensive to God and the most hopeless, the most incurable of all sins. Why? Because it blocks the very mercy through which God knows and relates to us.
That's a terrifying thought. If God can only be merciful, if that's His holy nature, and pride blocks mercy, then
we're cutting ourselves off from life itself. The lesson makes this clear when it discusses how God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble, quoting 1 Peter 5:5. When mercy can't flow through us because of pride, we spiritually die and become destructive to others.
Let's dig into this pattern. The lesson talks about Lucifer's pride in detail. What does Isaiah 14:1-14 reveal about how pride operates?
The lesson shows Lucifer's pride through 5 I will statements. I will ascend, I will exalt, I will sit, I will ascend, and I will be like the Most High. It's all about self-exaltation, trying to usurp God's place.
And that's exactly what happened with the Tower of Babel builders too, right? The lesson mentions they used the same language as God's creation account.
Yes. The lesson explains how the builders said, "Let us make," just like God said, "Let us make," when creating humanity. They were literally trying to replace God's creative authority with their own. Same pride pattern, self-exaltation leading to separation from God's mercy.
But here's what I find interesting. The lesson also gives us examples of humility. Moses is described as very humble, more than all men who were on the face of the earth. How does humility restore that merciful connection?
Moses is the perfect example. The lesson describes how he chose to suffer affliction with God's people rather than enjoy the pleasures of Egyptian palace life. He gave up power and riches because he understood something deeper about God's merciful authority.
And the lesson contrasts Moses with Pharaoh beautifully. When Moses encountered God, he asked, "Who am I?" recognizing his inadequacy. But Pharaoh refused to even acknowledge God's existence.
Exactly. Moses felt insignificant before God and wanted to know him relationally. Pharaoh couldn't acknowledge God because he thought of himself as God. One opened to mercy, the other blocked it completely through pride.
This brings us to Jesus' parable in Luke 18:9-14. The lesson uses the Pharisee and tax collector to illustrate this same dynamic.
Right. The Pharisee stood at the front, praying aloud about his own perceived goodness. The tax collector stood at the back, whispering, "Please, Lord, be merciful to me, a sinner." The lesson emphasizes that only he who knows himself to be a sinner can Christ save.
So humility isn't self-hatred, it's accurate self-assessment that opens us to God's merciful omniscience?
Absolutely. The lesson quotes Ellen White saying, "In one way only can a true knowledge of self be obtained. We must behold Christ. When we see him clearly, we realize our need and open to his mercy."
Now let's connect this to the Sabbath. You mentioned it's a weekly revelation of God's merciful authority. How does that work?
The Sabbath is fascinating because it represents both God's creative authority and his merciful nature. The lesson mentions that the Sabbath was established at creation and is a divine gift for rest and spiritual renewal, not just a Jewish tradition, but a universal ordinance.
But why does the specific day matter? Why can't we just pick any day for rest and worship?
Because changing the day removes God's authority as creator. The lesson emphasizes that the Sabbath commemorated God's rest from creation and signifies his deliverance. When we honor Saturday as Sabbath, we acknowledge both his creative power and his merciful redemption.
So it's not arbitrary legalism, it's about recognizing the source of mercy itself?
Exactly. The lesson shows how Jesus emphasized that the Sabbath was made for humanity's benefit, not as a burden. It's meant to be experienced through God's grace and provision, a weekly reset to that original merciful transparency.
This reminds me of Jesus healing on the Sabbath. The lesson mentions how he challenged the Pharisees' rigid interpretations.
Right. Jesus declared himself Lord of the Sabbath and emphasized mercy over ritual. The lesson quotes Hosea 6:6, "I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice." The Sabbath should reflect God's merciful character, not legalistic restrictions.
So when we approach Sabbath with mercy, both toward God and others, we're actually participating in his omniscient mercy?
That's beautifully put. The lesson emphasizes that we should be merciful just as our Father is merciful, quoting Luke 6:36. When we extend mercy to others, we become conduits of God's merciful omniscience.
But here's what strikes me. You said mercy is a daily thing, so the days of creation are a daily thing. What do you mean by that?
The lesson mentions that God's mercies are new every morning, quoting Lamentations 3:22-23. Each day requires fresh mercy, fresh humility, fresh openness to God's omniscient love. The creation pattern of work and rest becomes our daily rhythm of receiving and extending mercy.
That's profound. So every day we have the choice. Will we block God's mercy through pride or open to it through humility?
Exactly. And the lesson makes clear this isn't something we can do ourselves. It quotes Ellen White's prayer, "Lord, take my heart, for I cannot give it. Keep it pure, for I cannot keep it for thee." We need God's power to overcome pride.
Let's talk about practical application. The lesson mentions Yolanda, the 86-year-old Brazilian woman who helps people at her door. How does her story illustrate this merciful omniscience?
Yolanda's story is beautiful. When a mother with 3 barefoot girls came to her door, she immediately provided sandals and food. When asked why, she said, "I'm a Christian from the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and we like to help people." She was a conduit of God's mercy.
And that mother ended up wanting to study the Bible and was baptized a year later. So mercy literally opened her to God's omniscient love?
Absolutely. Yolanda wasn't preaching or arguing theology, she was simply extending mercy. That mercy revealed God's character and drew the mother to want to know him. It's omniscience through mercy in action.
This completely changes how I think about evangelism. Instead of trying to convince people intellectually, we're called to reveal God's merciful omniscience through our actions.
The lesson emphasizes that mission is really important and that all of us were born to be missionaries. But true mission flows from experiencing God's mercy ourselves and then extending it to others. It's not about superiority, it's about sharing the mercy we've received.
Speaking of superiority, the lesson talks about Jesus' disciples arguing about who was greatest. Even they struggled with pride despite being close to Jesus.
Right. The lesson points out that instead of being content with their calling, pride rose in their hearts. Jesus responded by saying, "He was among them as one who serves." The ultimate example of humility, serving others through mercy.
And Philippians 2:3-8 shows Jesus emptying himself, taking the form of a servant, becoming obedient to death. That's the opposite of Lucifer's 5 "I will" statements.
Exactly. Where Lucifer said, "I will exalt myself," Jesus humbled himself. Where Lucifer grasped for equality with God, Jesus didn't consider equality with God something to be grasped. Complete opposite approaches to divine relationship.
So when we look at Jesus, really look at him, what happens to our pride?
The lesson says when we pause long enough to see him truly and purely, we can't help realizing our impurity and desperate need of him. Everything else, especially our perceived greatness, pales into complete insignificance. Self disappears when we look at him.
That brings us back to omniscience as mercy. When we see ourselves clearly in light of Christ, we open to experiencing God's merciful knowing rather than fearing his judgment.
Beautiful connection. The lesson emphasizes that the nearer we come to Jesus and the more clearly we discern his character's purity, the more clearly we see sin's sinfulness and the less we feel like exalting ourselves. It's transformative.
And this transformation affects how we treat others. The lesson mentions that experiencing God's mercy enables believers to extend compassion and forgiveness to others.
Right. When we truly understand that our value comes from being created by God and being those for whom Christ died, not from our accomplishments or possessions, we stop needing to put others down to feel valuable ourselves.
So pride isn't just a personal problem, it's relational. It blocks mercy from flowing both from God to us and from us to others.
Absolutely. The lesson makes clear that pride impacts our relationships with both God and others. When we're proud, we can't receive mercy because we don't think we need it, and we can't extend mercy because we think others don't deserve it.
But humility opens both directions, receiving God's mercy and extending it to others. It's like becoming a conduit for divine omniscience expressed as mercy.
That's exactly right. The lesson emphasizes that those whom heaven recognizes as holy are the last to parade their own goodness. True holiness is characterized by humility that allows mercy to flow freely.
Let's bring this full circle. We started with Adam and Eve's nakedness representing transparency with God through mercy. How do we get back to that kind of openness?
The lesson provides the answer through Jesus' teaching that whoever humbles himself will be exalted. We return to transparency by acknowledging our need, confessing our sins, and trusting in God's faithful and just forgiveness, as promised in 1 John 1:9.
And the Sabbath becomes our weekly practice of this transparency, setting aside our work, our achievements, our pride, and simply resting in God's merciful authority.
Beautifully said. The Sabbath is our weekly return to Eden, a time to experience God's mercy without the barriers of pride, to remember that our value comes from Him, not from our productivity or accomplishments.
So when you step back from all this, here's what really matters. God's omniscience isn't something to fear, but something to embrace. It's his merciful consciousness experiencing all creation with compassionate love.
Exactly. And pride is the only thing that blocks us from experiencing this mercy. When we choose humility, acknowledging our need and God's goodness, we open ourselves to the same transparent relationship Adam and Eve originally had.
The Sabbath gives us a weekly opportunity to practice this transparency, to approach God and others with mercy rather than judgment, and to remember that changing the day would remove both his creative authority and his redemptive mercy.
And here's the beautiful thing. This isn't just theology. It's practical daily living. Every day we can choose mercy over pride, humility over self-exaltation, transparency over hiding. Every day we can be conduits of God's omniscient mercy to a world that desperately needs it.
Think about it this way. Next time you're tempted to hide behind fig leaves of pride, remember that God already knows you completely through mercy. The question isn't whether he sees you, but whether you'll let his merciful omniscience transform you. Thanks for joining us on Co-Pilot Podcast.